Good evening, my friends. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can be with you forever. I'm going to be leaving my email in the description, so if you want to contact me for tarot readings, astrology chart readings, music production lessons, spiritual guidance, what have you, I will be there. And make sure to join my YouTube membership program, as that's starting to get the ball rolling, and I'm doing daily videos, and I'm going to be uploading various lectures as well throughout my time here on YouTube. So, as you can see by the clickbait thumbnail and the title of this video, this is obviously going to be a controversial subject, but I want to illustrate this point from a rational aspect and understanding this dynamic and this culture clash that is currently happening in the world, specifically against, westernized aspects of culture versus the more Eastern, specifically Chinese aspects. So this is more of an American versus Chinese cultural element. However, both of those ways of thought are present amongst all countries and cultures and whatnot. In fact, I would argue that China in general in recent years has become more westernized than the West itself. And this is going to be causing a lot of issues, I think, within the structure of how that country is and generally how it's respecting itself. But this is going to be more towards the American side of things in terms of how, there is generally a rift between how they perceive Chinese culture, and there's this underestimation of what China can do and what China is capable of. And this is really at the root of where Chinese culture originates from, which is Taoism, essentially. I'm not even going to get into Buddhism because Buddhism is an Indian religion. It's not Chinese at all. It's an Indian guy that came to China, came to the East. There is that narrative of the savior from the West will come and save whoever in China, and that's where Buddhism comes from. It's not a Chinese religion, despite there being a large amount of people who practice Buddhism in China and where it was popularized the most, more so than India. But we're going to talk about Taoism because Taoism is not just a religion or a philosophy, but it is a scientific principle, and a scientific principle and a way of life that is rooted within pretty much all of Chinese history and Chinese culture, dating with the current Chinese government system, which is primarily based off of Confucianism, which was heavily disregarded by Mao Zedong, who was very much against traditional aspects of Chinese culture. And what I'm going to look into in terms of Chinese culture within this video is the relative strengths of that culture that is being present in the world that tends to be overlooked and underappreciated, specifically because of the fact that it is coming from China, and a lot of what China represents right now is seen in a very negative connotation, specifically because of manufacturing processes, the upending potential world war that might be happening that people are a little bit concerned about. However, it's important to recognize and understand Chinese culture from the standpoint of Taoism in order to actually see if there is a world war and if there is a culture clash, how that would play out depending on the cultural roots of both nations relative to America and China. And the thing about China and the thing about Taoism is that it's all based around being, comfortable and receptive to the way of heaven, so to speak. And what do I mean by that? I mean by the way things are and the way things play out, and being able to respond to those aspects instead of being a key force in implementing those things. So the aspect of what the Chinese government is doing, especially amongst playing out with how it's utilizing America against itself, and why Donald Trump, for instance, can't seem to negotiate with China effectively without there always being a rift between them, going back and forth between the tariffs in 2018, 2019, that whole trade war that was happening. But it also comes down to the idea that in China, that aspect and that mentality of negotiation that Donald Trump is used to, which is very forceful, very westernized, very this is what I want, this is how I'm going to get it, does not work against the Chinese culture, the Chinese nation as a whole, because their mentality is based off of receptive and letting things come in as they are. However, with that said, it's important to also recognize that while this is happening, and while Donald Trump is trying to implement and try to fear monger China, they are the ones holding all the cards, so to speak, in terms of where manufacturing and where everything that we consume pretty much is made. And they can pretty much not really assert any dominance through, visual cues or ways of being able to manipulate people through language. Their way of doing it is much more subtle and much more behind the scenes. If you notice that whenever Donald Trump tries to enact a sense of presence and a sense of action and a sense of bravado, the way China responds is very under the table, very low key, not really saying much, not really responding much, just being like, okay, and then sort of changing the dynamic behind the scenes. So this is an aspect that is going to play in throughout the warfare, because the way the West and generally America plays out negotiations and war is very much about creating a show or a spectacle somehow, that we are going to overcome you, you are the bad guy, we are the good guys, and we will overcome and we will beat you, and there will be this whole dramatic spectacle, so to speak, that is being implemented throughout this ordeal. And the way China does it, I've noticed, is very much not even mentioning or promoting an idea of war or any such nature, and instead just going through with it regardless of what you think. And then if you try to resist, there is this implementation that this is just happening and that there is nothing you can really do about it. It's very much of a silent war aspect that China emits. And this is something that you need to keep in mind, because people are so caught up in the westernized way of dealing with war, especially in the Middle East, which is very, very Western in terms of how it presents itself and how it's over the top and saying, we are ISIS, we will kill all infidels. China's not telling anyone what's going on at all. It's very secretive, it's very under the table. And there are a lot of aggressive narratives that China wants to implement. And that is being the supreme leader of the world, the supreme power of the world, right? The number one power in the entire world in terms of their economic strength and their just general output, I would say. And they're not going to let anyone know about this, which is why they are a hidden power that should not be overlooked or underestimated, especially because I am noticing, even before COVID and all of this stuff, how the dynamics of how Chinese people moving into Canada, for instance, has completely changed. What I remember, or just, in general younger life, if you'd have like a Chinese immigrant, they start a business, a small business, and they try to cater to Americans, right? This is the generalized aspect of what happens when immigrants come to a new country. They implement their own culture in a way that's presentable to whatever country they're living in, and that's primarily America. That was where General Tao Chicken came from and the fortune cookie came from, because they were trying to appeal to Western audiences. What's changed now, and what I've seen to notice, is that the new restaurants that are coming in, the new stores that are primarily run by Chinese people, and I'm talking very new, like within the last 2 or 3 years, they are not catered specifically for Westerners, but catered more to the Chinese people and Asians currently already living in those countries, right? So I'll give you a perfect example. There's this fried chicken place called Hot Star, And it's a very popular fried chicken place in Korea and China and I think Japan as well. And they opened one downtown Montreal, prime location. And I never heard of this place before, but I go there anyway and check it out. And I'm the only white person in that restaurant. Everyone's Chinese or Korean. And, I order. The person doesn't speak English. And I kind of just have to say the number out. And it was a very strange occurrence that this is how the new businesses that are being implemented are catered towards Chinese people. Even at the bank, the downtown bank, the TD branch, there are specific, financial advisors that cater specifically to Chinese immigrants moving into Montreal. There is literally specific people, and I had to actually speak with one for a personal matter that was catered towards Chinese immigrants moving to Canada. And this is a big thing because this is a big shift of how things are playing out, that this is no more of a scenario of, the poor, hungry immigrants coming in and trying to meld into the West. It's them coming in and saying, all right, this is where we are. We're setting shit up for us. And we don't really care if the Westerners already living here benefit from it or not. This is a completely new dynamic that's never really happened before. And this is something to keep in mind as we're going into the future of how the world is playing out, that there is an agenda by the Chinese government to, take over the world, let's just say, not in a literal sense, but in a sense that they are the number one supplier and the number one economic force in the entire world, where we pretty much buy everything through one of the Chinese corporations, so to speak. And that's pretty much what they want to accomplish. And regardless of if they succeed or not, you need to understand that that's what they want to do. And they're not going to tell you about it. It's just going to happen. And, this is where the West and Western people are going to be caught off guard because they're so used to the narrative of how America and the Middle East and every other country, tends to plan things out, which is, this is what we're going to do. I'm Donald Trump. I am going to become president. We're going to make America great again. I'm ISIS. We're going to bomb all the infidels, blah, 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 blah. This is the narratives that have been propagating for decades in mainstream news. But with China, they're not telling you shit. They're not telling you what's happening. They don't want you to know what's happening because that's not part of their war mindset. And this is something also to keep in mind, that people are afraid of China, let's just say, and there needs to be an understanding of how they play out things. And they generally, from what I've researched, play by a soft-handled tactic of being able to manipulate people to what they want. So, for instance, in the West in America, if the CIA thinks you're a spy or thinks you're against the country or something, or they think that you have information or you're a prisoner of war, generally they won't treat you very well. They'll put you in a shitty prison or they'll torture you until you give them the answers you want. This pretty much happens in a lot of different countries if you're a political prisoner. But in China, it's actually different because political prisoners are treated very well. They're very well accommodated. And what they do is they actually make you write essays, promoting Chinese ways of thinking, Chinese cultural elements, Chinese philosophical and political ideas, until you actually internalize those ideas and they become a part of you and you actually express those ideas that they're indoctrinating in you through a soft technique, which is done through, in a way of convincing you that, hey, we're not bad people, we're good, we care about people, right? This was a thing that people were concerned about when Vice published an article about this journalist trying to report on Wuhan, this laboratory that closed down by Chinese officials, and he wanted to report on it and investigate. He got arrested, and then now he's pro-China, pro-government, whatever, because That was what they did. They didn't indoctrinate you and force you through torture or anything like that. They treat you very, very well, and they accommodate you, but they do implement various techniques and mental manipulation techniques in order for you to actually switch sides, so to speak, so you see things from their point of view more so than your own. So this is something to also keep in mind, that this doesn't happen particularly in the West, because we're used to, mostly if someone disagrees with us, we yell at them and argue with them until we feel like we're superior and we make them feel like shit. This is something to keep in mind. If you've ever read the book How to Win Friends and Influence People, this is a tactic that could be used disadvantagedly towards the person who's receiving it, right? This isn't to say that this is good or bad, but this is the kinds of techniques that people will use specifically in China to get what they want, to convince people to get what they want, right? And this is not done through the traditional way of doing things. So this is where I think us in the West particularly have a severe disadvantage, because we are not really prepared mentally to deal with that kind of tactic in terms of war or terms of how things are played out, because we're so used to, being in this spectacle, this put on show, so to speak, of how war and arguments and discussions are supposed to be played out. So this is something to think about coming in, and I'm going to touch upon also the non-political aspects of more the medicinal aspects of Chinese culture, which is, traditional Chinese medicine, which, focuses purely on the internal aspects of the physical body, right? So, for instance, on a Western perspective, if you want to get in shape, how you would do that is you go to the gym and you work out your muscles until they get big. The Chinese perspective on that is that, yes, you can do that and you will attain muscles, but the muscles and the strength that you get is completely temporary for when you are a young person. And then as you get old, that strength diminishes over time. What they want is to cultivate an internalized aspect of strength, starting from the qi, the energetic system, and moving in through the muscles through that way, which requires a long process of internal training, meditation, tai chi, whatever. That is an element that is specifically missing from the West. Now, is this necessarily better or worse? Depends on your perspective. Obviously, for this video, I'm doing this get up here primarily as a joke a little bit, but I'm doing it to promote viewers and to understand that China is completely different, and it's a completely different way of thinking and a different cultural reservoir, if you want to call it that. Because don't forget, in the West, when we think about where all our culture is originating from, has already been shared amongst each other for thousands of years. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if you were to look at like language, for instance, the English language, right, and you're trying to translate it to something like French, for instance, you will find that there are still similarities between those two languages. If I say the word color in English, in French it's couleur. It's the same word. And that goes with a lot of different things. But in Chinese to English, everything is different. Every single thing, the complete foundation of the language, how it's structured, how it's put together, the symbols, everything is completely different. And this is something to keep in mind, especially as we're getting into more uncertain times of understanding China, how China works, which a lot of people in the West don't give a fuck. A lot of Chinese people, specifically younger Chinese people, don't give a fuck about Chinese history, Chinese culture. They're very much geared towards westernized ways of thinking, which is why China pretty much is the West at this point in time. However, Xi Jinping is very rooted in traditional Chinese culture with Confucius and all this other stuff. The thing is, China now is basically a massive contradiction of itself and is implementing both sides of these fears and amalgamating them into one nation. What the West is doing is rejecting a lot of shit. And this is the problem that it has. that is not really looking towards the benefits of the Chinese systems and Chinese culture, which China has been implementing. If you go to a pharmacy, it will implement both methods of Western medicine and traditional Chinese medicine, right? And you should know also the quality of things that you buy in China, made in China, is superior to the stuff that you get in America that is made in China. That was one thing I noticed when I went to China to visit, was that the quality of things is a little bit different depending on where you're going. There is some not as much quality control when it comes to street food and things of that nature, things that are relatively cheap. But I've noticed there are slight differences in terms of taste and products that you buy. Now, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how China relates to America in terms of the cultural representations. The thing in America that is very inferior to China is the fact that its political and unification of the nation is completely separated into two camps of right versus left, right? This is a huge issue because, look, like, if you're going to win a war, if this ever happens, if you're not unified as a country, as a nation, you're not getting anywhere. You're not going to win, right? The reason why the US won World War II was because it unified together. It got together for a single purpose that it wanted to accomplish, and everyone worked together and everyone did their part, and no one was really like, oh, this is stupid, this is a waste of time. No, there was a strong ideological message and vision behind it. Every single war after that was basically a forced representation of that, past unification that the US used to have. They lost because it wasn't actually real. Look at the Vietnam War. There was no unification in that war whatsoever. There was plenty of people that were completely against the war. They didn't know what the fuck they were doing there. It was a complete waste of time. And for that reason, they lost the war. And this has been happening repeatedly with wars that we enter into that America is not unified behind because they have no real purpose in doing that. They just want to maintain that vision of being the hero, the savior of the world, when in reality that's not really how it plays out. And China has a lot of pride behind that, which is actually a detriment to itself, which I'll get into in my next video if you want to take a guess about what that topic will be. And the thing about this disunification that America has, there's also a lot of ideological problems, political correctness problems. This is also a huge problem because this idea of political correctness, specifically dealing with cultural appropriation, all right? This whole narrative of cultural appropriation being a bad thing is a very dangerous mindset, because what that is instilling in people is that learning from other cultures, appropriating cultures for your own benefit to be able to expand and, become a better person is seen as a negative thing. So people who want to learn different methods of culture, so let's say if I want to learn acupuncture, or let's say I want to learn yoga, there is a significant issue that is arising from utilizing those cultures to your benefit that is being pushed down a little bit. There is a narrative that's saying that you should be ashamed as a white man or a white person in general, that if you want to engage in certain aspects that exist in cultural practices that exist outside of your race, that's somehow a negative thing and you should feel ashamed about that. That's a narrative that exists, and it's a narrative that I've witnessed personally and I've felt personally as well, delving into specific arts, which is why you find that people who are interested in Eastern philosophy or Eastern whatever are, tend to be in the minority, although they do exist, but they tend to be shamed upon. They tend to be made fun of a lot. There is a lot of bullying involved in this cultural appropriation aspect. And the fact that China is sort of rejecting its own culture in and of itself is replicating that tenfold. So there's not a lot of learning going on in the West in terms of appropriating things, because don't forget, appropriation is taking something and making it your own, right? This whole notion of cultural appreciation is complete bullshit. The only way you can appreciate culture is if you just see culture exist and you take absolutely no place or learning anything from it. You just look at it and you say, oh, this is nice. This is a nice little thing. And appropriation is when you actually take that culture and you say, this is mine now. How am I going to utilize this? How am I going to utilize this to my benefit? Which is what made America one of the strongest nations of its time, because it appropriated cultures. Fuck appreciation of culture. It's appropriation of culture that actually makes people better, right? Italian food, you want to know why it's so good? Because they appropriated Chinese culture, Chinese food, and made it their own and made it better, right? This is how it works. This is what China did, all right? They appropriated Western culture and made it their own, right? This is why Chinese people are so proud of themselves, even though all of their culture that they are propagating on an externalized level, there's still a lot of specifically Chinese cultural elements that still exist, obviously. But what they are implementing is primarily from the West. Primarily from the West, what they've learned from the West, every business idea, every business prospect, every way of conducting business, and specifically within that realm, they appropriated and made it their own thing. So now we're playing the role of receiving the way Chinese people do business because of the fact that they appropriated it, and because of the fact they appropriated it, they were managed to become even more powerful. And because they became more powerful, now they have the ability to appropriate as many cultures as they want to attain power. Whereas the West, appropriating culture is seen as a negative thing. So forget any progress, forget any learning, forget anything related to that at all, because cultural appropriation is politically incorrect. It's bad. It's not fair to steal culture. And when you say that, you're putting yourself at a severe disadvantage to improve yourself, to become a better person, and to share information. And what you are doing when you are saying cultural appropriation is bad is you're actually creating factions. You're creating divisiveness. You're saying you belong to this group of people, you belong to that group of people, you belong to this group of people, right? And with China, especially ancient China, if you look at the Qin dynasty, they had a lot of different languages and a lot of different dialects that were not unified. If you see the movie Hero with Jet Li, it stresses upon this theme of unification in terms of that way, which is what China is really big about. It's really big about unification, one world, one nation, all of that, which is based off of the Chinese nationalism, right? Which is really just a mastermind. It's a collective mindset that is created by them. So I'm going to leave it at that. Obviously, I'm going to be pissing people off. So feel free to release your angry comments in the comment section below. And I might reply, I might not. But make sure to like, comment, subscribe anyway, and turn on notifications so I can be with you forever. And make sure to join my YouTube membership program where I will have a lot more exclusive content available to all. So thanks for watching, and peace out.